Hey guys, it's Amelia but not the pilot, just Amelia. It is the end of March. We did it. So let's get into it. This month I read 15 books. Still unemployed, so that's why this is happening. I read 7 audiobooks and 8 books this month. So I'm still averaging about I guess 2 books a week. And then an audiobook every 3 days. I don't consistently listen to audiobooks. In fact, I don't think I listened to any audiobooks this week at all. But some days I'll listen to an entire audiobook in one day just because I'm doing chores around the house and design things that I don't fully need to pay attention to, or taking lots of bus rides and whatever. So I'll listen to audiobooks then. Let's get into it. First off, let's start with audiobooks because boys, I listened to a bunch of books that I've read already this month. So I listened to the entire Vampire Academy series this month. So books 2 through 6, because I read the first one last month, if you recall. My conclusion is that the first 3 books are fun. They're pretty good. They're interesting. They're not super problematic. I think they hold up. And then after that, it's just awful. They're so bad because it has this whole plot with, trying to do this without too much spoilers, one of the characters becoming an abusive, evil vampire. But their relationship is it sort of falls apart, but then they get back together. And I hated it. So the last ones are they're just really off the rails, and they're just not very good. I'm not going to go into it anymore. If you want to know more about Vampire Academy, I summarized it in my last video. I liked the first 3. I recommend the first 3. Besides that, that's all you need. Next, I re-listened to Addie LaRue. The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by B.E. Schwab is one of my all-time favorite books. And I just felt like it was time. I haven't actually read it in 2 years, I think was the first time I read it. I think it came out 5 years ago, maybe? I don't know. I felt like it was time. And so I read it as an audiobook, which was fun. I've never done that before. And I also read it in March. And most of the book is set in March, so I feel like it's the perfect spring March book. It also has very fall vibes, though, I feel. It's very weather-y, if that makes any sense. But if you don't know, Addie LaRue is one of my all-time favorite books. I recommend it to everyone. Plot follows a girl who is in the 1800s or 1751, I think, in France, and she is in an arranged marriage that she wants to get out of, and so she prays to the gods that answer at night, which you should never do, and as a result she gets her wish granted, but it's not how she thought it would be granted. So she ends up being immortal in the fact that she never gets hurt or dies type of thing, but she also is not remembered by anybody. And so she now has to navigate this new life of how can she find happiness, how can she make connections and interact with people if they never remember her. I just think it's so good. It's delicious. And so the book follows her. Her name is Addie. And there's another character named Henry who is in the present day, 2014 or something, in New York City. And she meets him. And so it's it goes back and forth in the timelines. You're getting her whole backstory of how she got to the present day interspliced with her current day relationship meeting this man and how things go down and all that jazz. I love it. It's tragic. It's very good. It's dark academia, spooky vibes. It's one of my favorite books, so I reread that, and I had a good little time. And then I listened to Colin Jost's memoir. He is the guy from SNL. He's on Weekend Update. He's also a writer for SNL, and his memoir is called A Very Punchable Face, which I think is very funny. I don't think I would have read this memoir, to be quite honest, except for the fact that one of my friends was talking about it recently, and she mentioned that there was a name of a town in it that she recognized because I have been there before. And so we were talking about that, a place in the US that she didn't know about. So after we talked about it, I was and she said it was good, so I thought I would check it out. And I thought it was genuinely quite good for a memoir. I am very particular about my memoirs. I feel I love when they're funny. I love when the person's life is actually interesting and they have crazy weird stories. And I also feel a good memoir has this aspect of teaching you something, where it shows the person had growth and they're sharing it with you and how you too can grow. In my head, that's the perfect memoir. So for this book, I feel like this is a perfect memoir. I would relate it a lot to Tina Fey's Bossy Pants, which is also one of my all-time favorite memoirs. And I feel like it's not just your average celebrity memoir of like them talking about their crazy little life and that's it. Like, you're just learning about their lives, which is fun and fine in its own. Like, that's why those memoirs exist. But I thought his memoir was quite good, and it was very fun. And he has weird life, man. He's got some crazy stories. So that was really fun. I gave it 5 stars. I recommend it. Then book-wise, I read Godkiller, which is a book we read for my book club. I didn't love Godkiller. The plot jumps between a few different characters, and it has a sort of D&D vibe of it's a band cast of characters who all end up meeting together and going on a quest together to one goal type of thing, which I thought was fun. And the world building was definitely interesting, but I felt like the characters' voices weren't distinct enough, and the writing was a bunch of different POVs, and I didn't feel like we needed the different POVs. I almost felt like it should have just been like third person, omnipotent, whatever, omnipresent, whatever the word is, like overlooking what's going on, because I don't know why we were constantly changing the perspectives. It didn't really add anything to the story. And they were, almost all the characters were together the whole story as well. And I also felt like the more interesting part of the story was the backstory, not the current things that were happening. So the plot follows, I don't remember the characters' names because I read this at the beginning of the month. I'm sorry. But this is another problem I had. The characters also had like fantasy names and I couldn't keep them straight because they all had similar sounding voices in their perspectives. I will say I loved the disability representation in this story. There was queer, there was diversity, there was a disability rep, there was a person who signed, and the main character didn't have a leg. So I thought that was really cool, because I don't actually think I've ever read a book where the main character doesn't have a leg. I thought that was really fun. We love representation. The plot. The main character, she comes from a village where they worship the sea god, and her family happens to be in favor of the sea god, like a favorite of the sea god. But the rest of the town ends up betraying the sea god and start worshiping this other fire god. And the town ends up deciding to sacrifice her family in a fire as an offering to the gods. But she ends up escaping, but she loses her leg. And now we flash forward like 10 years later. She's now an adult, and she is now a god hunter. So gods have been banned in the world, and there's now these god hunters who are basically like a Witcher type of vibe, like a mercenary for hire god killer, and they just go from town to town. That's how they make their wage. They go to the shrine, they kill the god. It's her, and then there's this other character who's like a teenage girl who comes from a rich family who has happened to somehow get connected to this tiny god that looks like a rabbit, and the god is the god of white lies. And so they end up meeting and things go down. There's also this other man character who is like the right hand to the king. He used to be a knight for the king, and now he no longer is. He's a baker. I enjoyed this story, but I will say that it felt a little cliche where I thought it didn't need to be, because I feel like it's such an interesting and cool world, and the world building was really interesting, and the backstories were really interesting, but the plot itself seemed really boring, and I don't know why. There is a sequel that has just come out by this author for this series, but I don't think I'm going to read it because I just wasn't wowed by this book. I was expecting it to be very exciting, and then I was a little disappointed. However, I will say 4 stars. Like, it was a good book. I had a good time. It's not the best thing I've ever read. Next, I read 2 comics this month. I finally finished Sandman. I've been reading Sandman for like months. I just am not super into it. I have been trying to get into Neil Gaiman, and I read Good Omens last year and I loved it. And then Sandman I decided to read because there's a TV show, so I was like, oh, I should read this comic before I watch the TV show. However, I'm pretty positive the TV show isn't that, I think it's loosely based on the comic, because the comic is wild and weird and doesn't really have too much of a through plot, I feel like. So I was a little disappointed in that, because I'm not a big comic reader in the first place, and I don't really like superhero vibes. So for me, I feel like that was it's just not my vibe. But overall, the Sandman plot, if you're wondering, follows the Sandman, who is a god, who is captured by this like occult society, and they keep him in a jar for like years, and as a result things go bad because the Sandman controls all dreams and stuff like that. And so now people are in comas, and people are not having dreams, or they're having too many dreams, or they're having nightmares only, and whatever. And so when he's finally freed, he goes around and he has to, it's like his story of redemption and finding all his like helm of power and all that jazz. And then there's a bunch of other random stories where he's like sometimes there, but not really. That's what I'm sort of confused about, is that I felt like overall the Sandman comic barely has the Sandman in it. I felt like the art style was really cool and interesting, but I also didn't love it. And I think that's a big thing for me. I mostly choose video games and comics and things like that based on how aesthetically pleasing they are to me. And if I don't love the style and I'm like obsessed with how pretty it is, then I won't like it that much. So I think that's why. So I read Sandman, but I also read Nimona. If you don't know, Nimona is a Netflix movie that just came out this past year and won a lot of awards. That's how I became aware of it, but it was first a comic, and it's a standalone comic. It's very short. I want to say 10 chapters. I read it in like an hour. It's very cute. I like it a lot. It's got medieval vibes, but it's like an urban fantasy, which I thought was fun. So it's got knights and swords and stuff, but it also has like some technology things going on. I thought the comic was really fun, but I will say I liked the movie better, and that doesn't happen very often. I think the movie made a better plot and wrapped a lot of the characters better, if that makes any sense, where the comic sort of doesn't wrap things up. It felt very open-ended and not finished. But I did really like it. I recommend both the movie and the comic book if you're interested. Next, I read a duology. This is probably the highlight of my month, was Divine Rivals and Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross. I didn't realize until after I finished this book that I've already read a Rebecca Ross book and I loved it. I read this one. I don't remember what it's called right now. And I really liked it. And I have been seeing fan art for Divine Rivals all over my Instagram, and that's how I decided to end up reading it, because I was like, these vibes seem nice. They seem exactly up my alley. And that's why I decided to pick up the book. And then I realized it's the cover. I choose books based on covers all the time. And it's really sad because it's the graphic designer in me. I'm like, if you have a poorly designed cover, I'm not gonna read your book. I'm sorry. Like, it just doesn't find me, because how else do you find books? I mostly choose books on like, I found a really pretty cover, I want to read that book now. Even if it's bad, I'll read the whole thing. I saw the US cover for Divine Rivals. I think is quite ugly and doesn't like give the right vibes. But the UK covers have sort of like fan art drawn people on the cover, and I don't love that either. But it has better vibes, I feel like, in my opinion. But anyway, the plot of Divine Rivals. It is a urban fantasy book set in like a city, in like a World War I vibe, and it is academic rivals to lovers, which I've never read before, and I loved it. It was such a fun little book. So basically the two characters, Iris and Kit, I don't remember his first name. Iris and Kit both work at the same newspaper establishment, and they are competing to be chosen to be like one of the head writers, the columnist, at the end of their internship. And he comes from money. He's rich. He's got a fancy house, and she is poor. She has a single parent. Her brother went away to the military. Her mom has fallen to alcoholism, and she's the main breadwinner now, and she needs this job, but also she's a good writer, and she loves writing, and she loves journalism. And so they meet, and there's a lot of tension going on, but there's also a war happening in this country, and it's a war between the gods, and there is a god. I want to say it's sort of like Hades and Persephone vibes. So the Hades character is sort of like this evil war character. He's sort of like Ares as well, if you know Greek mythology. And then the Persephone character, if you will, is like a god of music. I don't know how to explain it further than that, but it's sort of Hades and Persephone, but a little different. It's a twist. But that's what it reminded me of. And so it's all these people fighting this war for these gods on the fronts, but it's a World War I type of vibe. So they have ammunition, but they also sort of have some mythical things going on, like wyverns and like hellhound type of beasts. And I just thought it was delicious. It was the perfect vibes. I loved the vibe, and I devoured both of these books in like 2 days. It was so good. The way the first one ended, I was like, ah! Immediately read the second one, and it was amazing. I loved both of them. I will say, I felt like the way the first one ended, it sort of wrapped up nicely. Like, I didn't feel like it needed a second one, and I wasn't fully on board with how the second one started, but then I liked it a lot. I also will say, this is also no spoilers, the way the first one ended, I was like so annoyed at Iris. And that's all I'm gonna say. Another cute aspect of this book is that a lot of their love story is told through writing letters. So the whole concept is that they have these magical typewriters, and the magical typewriters send letters to each other. So it's sort of like a pen pal. It's got like that miscommunication trope going on. It's got a lot of little tropes that I thought were very fun. Next, I read Bride. I like Ali Hazelwood. As previously stated, I'm not a big romance reader. I just don't really like them that much. I'm here for the plot. And but I've been seeing this book everywhere, and I've also seen that everyone's talking about this book because it is sort of like mainstream's first steps into the Omegaverse. I will not be explaining what that is. You can go look it up if you want, but I thought I was just very interested in that whole discourse of people talking about how sort of like subcultures making their way into mainstream culture. I'm interested in that conversation. So I had to read Bride. I also love a vampire, so I'm here for it. So I read Bride. It's by Ali Hazelwood. I've only read one of her other books before. I've read Love Hypothesis, which I also think is funny because it also has a fanfic start. It started as Reylo fic from Star Wars. And this one also clearly has like a fanfic sort of base, if you will. It was very tropey, but I think it was very well written. Like, I was enjoying the story part of it, and I thought it was funny. There was some quirky little things, like the vampires have like a very like bureaucratic system, which I thought was funny, and they like live in a mall, like very funny. And then it's got a like forced proximity arranged marriage situation with a vampire woman and a werewolf man. Are they compatible? Who knows? I had a fun little time. I wouldn't say werewolves are for me. I don't think I will be reading any more werewolf books, but I liked the vampire bits. I don't know what to rate this book because I did like it, but at the same time I didn't. But I do think all of the ACOTAR girlies and the Twilight girlies are gonna eat this up. So if you're one of those, you're gonna love this book. It was delicious. I will say my one main problem with the romance was how ridiculous. I am not a big fan of the like first time trope, if you will, because I guess this is sort of a spoiler, but not really, that she's a virgin, but then they do all of these things before she's even had her first kiss, before they have their first kiss. And I thought that was dumb and weird. And I don't love it. I also read How Do You Live this month, which is the book that Hayao Miyazaki was inspired from this book to create his newest movie, The Boy and the Heron. I don't really know how this book is related at all. It really has nothing to do with The Boy and the Heron. I will say, I watched the movie first, and there's a little cameo of the book in the movie. That book is in the movie. You'll see it. It's on his desk. But I don't really feel like the book has anything to do with the movie, and the book plot was fine. It's definitely like more of like a kid's book, so maybe it's just not for me. And then it's set in Japan, and it's like this little boy and his uncle sort of like learning about the world, and interconnectivity is what it's all about. And I didn't feel like I learned anything, but I also feel like maybe this book is for children, and maybe that's why. Next, I read Our Dark Duet by V.E. Schwab. This is the sequel to Our Savage Song, and this is one of her children's books. I really liked this series, but I will say it's very interesting for me to see that this is one of her earlier books in her career, and it's also sort of regarded as one of the ones that flopped. I don't really feel like it flopped. I think it was quite good. But I sort of see why, because her world building in this duology is so interesting, but it's so much information at once, not super explained. It's one of those fantasy books that just puts you in it and you just have to pick it up as you go, which I did eventually figure out what's going on, but I felt very lost in the first book. And if I felt lost as an adult 25-year-old, I cannot imagine how a child would be able to read this. This is a child fantasy book. So I really enjoyed it, and I thought it was very interesting because it's a twist on vampires, basically, is how I would say it. Because there's 3 monsters in the series, and I think functionally they are all vampires. They're sort of like one of them is sort of like a siren. And so the plot of this duology, I'm not going to tell you about the second one, really. I'm just going to give you an overall sort of plot of this duology, since I read the first one a couple months ago. But the plot is that we're following 2 different characters. We're in a dystopian US where the different cities have sort of quarantine, sort of like a zombie vibe, like Last of Us, how each city is now in a wall, and they are all sort of cut off from each other. So you're on your own, you're just in your city, and that's it. I don't remember where the city is. I want to say it's Houston, but I don't really remember. And so it's just the one city, and the city is divided into north and south. And on the south side of the city, we have the rebels who are trying to fight back. They've made like a civilian army, and they are trying to take back the city from the monsters. And then the north side of the city is sort of like the richer people, and they are just sort of living like it's not happening. We see the children of the 2 leaders of each side, sort of how they are dealing with their different situations. So on the south side, we have August, who is our main character, and he is one of the monsters. The whole concept of the book is sort of like, who is the monster and who is the man? Like that the Notre Dame type of vibe of like, he is a monster, but he cares a lot, and he doesn't want to be a monster. So is he just a monster because that's how he's born? Or what does a monster make? Like, what maketh a man, or whatever. And so August is a Sunai, which is sort of like a siren vampire, is how I'll say it. The Sunai have black eyes, and but besides that, they blend in with humans. You can't really tell that they're not human. There's not that many of them, but the way they are they're created is from mass death events, which I think is a very interesting concept. So a mass shooting, a bomb explosion, a earthquake, or something like that a lot of civilians die. Out of the rubble, one Sunai will rise. So August was born of some sort of catastrophe, and his powers include being able to sing or play an instrument. So there's a couple different Sunai. His specific instrument is a violin. So with his violin, he's able to like reap human souls. So when he plays his violin, all of the humans sort of go like glassy-eyed numb, and he could see their souls, and he could see all of the pure, innocent ones are just white souls, and he leaves them alone. And then all of the evil souls, so anyone who's killed somebody, has their soul tainted red, and he reaps those souls, he eats them, and that's what sustains him. So he does not eat human food. he only eats bad souls. So he needs to reap these evil people to survive. And he tries to just kill murderers and pedophiles and stuff like that. But sometimes his job is to kill all of the red souls. But sometimes, like, what if it was a person who is just defending themselves? And still their soul is turned red, but he is drawn to them to eat their souls. So he is a Sunai, and he is being raised by the leader on the south side, who has like found these different Sunai children and is like adopted them so that they blend in, and he's claiming that they're his own children, and sort of using them, and he's using these monsters to defeat the other monsters. Then on the north side, this is like a lot of plot, right? This is just the basics. So we have on the north side of the town, we have Kate, who is the daughter of a like rich politician man who is in league with a different type of monster. He's working with the Malachi, who are basically just a vampire. They got like red eyes, they're evil, they drink people's blood. That's it. And he's working with the Malachi, and he thinks he's controlling them, but is he? And Kate was raised to be really tough and hard and like aggressive, but she's just a human, and she's like a very good foil to August, who's so soft and doesn't want to hurt people but has to, and she's aggressive and wants to hurt people before they hurt her. And then there's one other type of monster, and they are called the Corsai, and they are basically sort of like zombie vampires, is my opinion on them. They can't go out in the sunlight, and they eat people, and they're sort of like mindless. So I feel like it's a very interesting world building, and very interesting characters and monsters and dynamic, and it's all in this little city, but there's too much going on, and it was really hard to understand from the get-go. But I really think you should give the series a try. I liked it a lot, and I think I'm gonna be thinking about this for a while. Like, I put it down and I was like, ooh. I love books that have like moral quandaries like that, like what makes a monster and what makes a man. You'll have to read to find out. And that was the last book that I have read this month. I have an absolute pile of books waiting for me for April, so we shall see how I get through these. But first off, I'm currently reading Where the Dark Stands Still. I actually really like this cover. The US cover, I think, is different. It just recently came out. I thought the vibes were my vibes, so I picked it up. It's a little slow for me to get into so far, but hopefully it'll pick up. I have a feeling I'm gonna like it, but we'll see. Next we have Warm Hands of Ghosts. This just recently came out, and I got my hands on it, and I feel like the vibes are my vibes. We'll see. You're gonna see a theme here. I usually don't know what a book is about when I go into it. I don't really like to know. I go on literally vibes alone. I go on recommendations of people who are like, I read this, I think you'll like it. Or vibes of, that cover looks like a cover I'd like to read. Next we have Book of Love. I actually don't like this cover, but the other cover that I saw looked nice. However, it's very thick, so I'm not quite sure if I'm gonna be able to get to this month, just because I have like 8 books out of the library right now, and I don't think I'm gonna have time for this. But I am planning on reading this. It also just recently came out. And then the ones I am most excited for is, I've been seeing this all over Instagram, and I just think the covers are absolutely gorgeous, but I've also seen a lot of fan art, and I think it's right up my alley. It is a Once Upon a Broken Heart, and then it's a trilogy, so I got all 3 from the library, because that's how I roll. I think the second one is this one, Ballad of Never After, and the third one is A Curse for True Love. I just think the covers are beautiful. I'm just sort of obsessed. Also, I really like the fact that there's not a singular... Oh, this one has it. A singular, like, quote from an author. I hate these little author quotes that are like, Jodi Picoult read this book and she loved it. I don't care. Like, I know that means, like, oh, it's vetted by a good author, so that means it's gonna be a good book. But I also don't really believe them. I sort of feel like, I don't think these authors are reading your book and then giving you a review. I don't know. I don't really know. I know it is a big deal when you get like a nice review from a well-known author like Jodi Picoult or whatever, but I also feel like Jodi Picoult is not the author that I'm reading, really. And I don't think she's the same genre. Jodi Picoult is writing, like, fiction, like, contemporary fiction. And this is giving high fantasy. That's not the same. It was a little confusing. But I like that this one doesn't have any quotes. That makes me happy. I don't want quotes on my books. I want pretty covers. You heard it here first. I think those are all of my goals for April. I'm sure there's going to be a random bunch of other books. I'm planning on listening to the Lord of the Rings audiobooks this month, and also Anne of Green Gables, because I'm like halfway through that series. There's like 10 books. So I've been listening to those as audiobooks because I think they're spring vibes, and I don't need to read it. I just want to listen to it. So that's my month. Stay tuned to see if I actually read all of these books from the library. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!